there in the 60s and 70s when those young men died in Vietnam. So, we're talking about the Ken Burns PBS series. That was kind of the catalyst for this book, fall of the century, correct? Fall of 2017. Some of you watched that documentary series. I know parts of it were controversial, I guess. But Ken Burns, I mean, these are long, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 hours. A lot of interviews, and I've always liked his style because he introduces individuals in places in the context of the war, and you kind of follow them through several episodes. It's very effective. This really started when he started, his first major documentary series was Baseball, which is about 12 hours about the history of baseball. Of course, I had to watch that. And then the Civil War series, the same approach. So as I'm watching this, I'd always been interested in Vietnam. As I mentioned, I graduated from high school in 1970. I started going to the local community college. And then after a year of college, I was eligible for the third Nixon lottery. And my number came up 263. And so I was able to keep my college deferment and keep going to college and things like that. Over here. Oh, that's fine. Glad you're here. There were a few people in my class who were either drafted or went down and signed up after they knew they were going to be drafted. But by that time, as you veterans know, and those of you who have studied this, the war was winding down. And in fact, in the last full year of the war, 1972, for the United States, we had only about 6,000 of our troops in Vietnam were combat troops. So things were really winding down, and then in 73, of course, you had the ceasefire agreement and the pullout of U.S. troops. There were still some troops there to guard the embassy and security, things like that. But most of the guys came home. So I got interested in, I'm going to go on the internet. I've gotten pretty good at searching for things on the internet, and there's so much out there. It's just unbelievable. And I wanted to reacquaint myself, who are the guys from Norfolk who died in Vietnam? And I found a list for Nebraska, and then it was broken down by town and city. And there were these 9 names of these 9 individuals you see before you on the handout. Some of these guys, I really didn't know who they were. And I'd lived in Norfolk since 1963, so I was kind of like, I don't know these guys. But some of my friends who were a little bit older, they knew who they were, but not everybody. And so I started to do research just on my own to find out. I taught high school history for 36 years, so that's kind of my bent. One of the first guys I looked at, I kind of did it in chronological order. So Dennis Anderson, he's on the top, what is that, left-hand side? And the first place I went for every one of these individuals was a place called the Caufelt database. Has anybody ever used the Caufelt database? You just Google Caufelt database and you get this sheet starting out. And they work with the National Archives, and they've compiled files on every person who died in the war. So that's over 58,000 files. And it just gives you some basic information that has been pulled from a number of sources. And even at times, there's documents that you can click on, and the document will flash up there. So this is where I started with Dennis Anderson, and one of the first things I noticed, went down, and I'm going to have to get my glasses. About 2/3 of the way down this list of items is casualty data. And the first line says, the code is C1, means he's non-hostile. Non-hostile fire, died outright from other causes. The second one is accidental homicide. and the third one is ground casualty. So right away, it's like accidental homicide. I need to figure that out because that's going to be part of the story. By that time, I decided I'm writing a book. Little did I know it would take me 4.5 years, but I wrote a book. Eventually, I was able to find out what happened to him from his daughter. Now, I talked about internet sleuthing, finding things out on the internet. I found his daughter. First of all, I found her name in a funeral newspaper article from the Olympia, Washington paper. And I looked all over for that name, Danette Anderson, and luckily she was on Facebook as Danette Anderson Thompson. And so I sent her a Facebook message. So Facebook is worthwhile for some things, I guess. Historical research, right? At first, their family was very wary of giving me information. Who is this guy, right? Is he going to ask for money sooner or later? Credit card number? No. So within a fairly short amount of time, she realized I was asking her the right questions, that I was serious, and one of the things I wanted to know was about their family and her dad's history. I found out he was born on the Pine Ridge or the Rosebud Reservation in 1936, depths of the Depression, and on the Indian Reservation. He's an enrolled member of the Chicancho Lakota tribe, along with his mother. And I I'd ask her specific questions about the research I'd done, and she could tell that I wasn't just shooting in the dark. I had some information. And she confirmed a lot of that, and some of it was new information to her. But this is where I started. I'd like to read to you. Like you to read? No. I'd like to read to you a section that is based on a source that came from Danette. She had been wondering, when her dad died in 1966, she was 7 years old. She had an older sister who was 11, a brother who was 4, and the youngest child was 3 months old. They lived just outside Fort Lewis, Washington, where he was stationed. He was a cannoneer, artillery man, right? When she got older, she wanted to know details. What happened to my dad? There was no attempt to buy the Army to, cover up or anything like that. They said he was accidentally shot by a U.S. soldier. It was in the newspaper. But she wanted the details. How'd that happen? So eventually in 2009, she found out. I'd like to read that a short section from the book. Staff Sergeant Dennis Anderson died at Camp Pinari on Sunday, December 11th, 1966, waiting in reserve to be called into action. The details of his death can be found in an email to Anderson's daughter, Danette, dated August 2009. Danette was just 7 years old when her father died in Vietnam. She understood that he had been accidentally shot by a U.S. soldier, but wanted to know more. Jack Stewart, the XO of Battery B. He is Dennis Anderson's commanding officer. Responded to her request for more information. Quote, I remember very well the incident of Anderson's death, he wrote. About mid-morning on the 11th, he was being given a haircut by our battery medic when an infantryman on the perimeter accidentally discharged his weapon. The errant round struck Anderson in the head. He died instantly. In his email, Stewart apologized for not remembering more about his section fire chief. Quote, I wish I could add something else for Anderson's family, but he was with us a very short time. Anderson was a replacement troop. His unit had been sent out of Fort Lewis in July. He was allowed to stay home for the birth of his daughter, which happened in late August. And he was allowed to stay a few more weeks before he shipped out. As far as I can tell, he didn't see any action in Vietnam. He was at a forward operating base. I imagine he didn't inherit to go out to set up a fire base when he died. So that's how he died. Now, this is I'm going to read the introduction to the chapter. How Anderson joined the Army. And I think for some of you veterans out there, it might sound familiar because it was him and a buddy, right? In adventure. I don't know if that fits your story or not, but that's how he joined up. And he was 17 years old. Okay. So I'll read the heading. All the chapters are kind of headed the same way. The name, and then something else I'll talk about a little bit with you. Chapter 1, Dennis W. Anderson, panel 13E, row 31. Now the panel in row is given at the head of each chapter under the man's name. What does that refer to? Panel in row.
The wall.
The wall, where you can find their name on the wall. So you already know if you read the prologue that these men are not going to survive the war, but this is further confirmation as their name is on the wall, and this is where it's located. Okay, here's the introduction. On February 3rd, 1954, Dennis Anderson and his friend Everett White walked into the local recruiter's office at the Norfolk Federal Building and enlisted to serve in the United States Army. Dennis and Everett, affectionately called Bunky and Punk by family and friends, had known each other for years. They had grown up just 2 blocks from one another on Burgess Avenue, a poor neighborhood of small homes and shanties populated by whites, Native Americans, and the town's lone African American family. This was an opportunity to serve their country, to step out of small town Nebraska, to earn a regular paycheck. For Anderson, there undoubtedly was one more reason. The Army was in his blood. The great-grandfather had served as a scout on the northern Great Plains in the 1800s. His father had served a hitch during World War II. 5 of his mother's brothers had enlisted as well, and one of his uncles, Sergeant Enoch Jack Raymond, had been killed in Italy during the last year of the war. Now it was Anderson's turn to do his duty. And in early February, he and White boarded the bus for Fort Riley, Kansas, and basic training. So that's how he got into the Army. And it was 1954. Nobody, what was happening in Vietnam in 54? The French were leaving. Vietnam was not really on our radar screen at all. But he ended up being a career soldier. He was 30 years old when he died and had nearly 13 years of service to his country. He'd been posted in Alaska for 2 years, West Germany for 2 stints, and then he went to Vietnam. As I mentioned, he left behind a wife and 4 children. So this is Dennis Anderson. That was the first chapter that I wrote. And it took a while to get all that information. But eventually, Nanette came through with some great information about her dad. I think part of it, she told me in an email, I'm remembering things that I really hadn't thought about for 40, 50 years that I forgot that I knew. So that was pretty common. I imagine when you talk to your buddies, they'll recall things, you'll recall things like, oh yeah. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book. I want people to know who these people are, and I want their families to be a part of that process. Okay. Does anybody have any questions before I go on? Of these 9 men, just to talk in generalities, and you can kind of see this on the pictures. 8 of the 9 are Army. And the one man who's not Army, you can see in the top row with the white hat on, is Navy Commander Tom Sherrick. I'll talk more about Tom Sherrick later and some of these other men too. Anderson, as I mentioned, Sherrick, and Jerome Chandler on the bottom row, they were career servicemen. I mentioned that Anderson was 30 when he died. Tom Sherrick was 35 when he died in Vietnam. He also had married 4 children. His kids were a little older. They were two girls in high school, a son in middle school, a daughter in elementary school. My main contact for Tom Sherrick was Tom Jr., who's now 60-some years old, right? Yeah, he was a great source. Gave me all kinds of information. And then Jerome Chandler, he was, this is the phrase I use, drafted by a judge. And 2 of these guys were drafted by a judge. He actually was living in Omaha at this time with his family, and
go to jail or
his
military.
Yeah, jail or Vietnam. I was able to contact his sister after a lot of effort. It was difficult to get a hold of her, but she was very candid about their family situation when Jerome, they called him Jerry, of course, was growing up, and he had an abusive alcoholic family. His older brother joined the Marines as soon as he could after high school to get out of that situation. Jerome's path was a little different. He got in so much trouble with the law that a judge told him, "You're going in the military, son, or you're going to go to jail." This was in Omaha. So he chose the military, Army. And then he told his sister, this was exactly what I needed. Discipline, structure, respect, buddies who weren't into breaking the law. That's what he needed. And so he really felt that the Army saved him. Now he had roots in Norfolk, and he put Norfolk as his hometown when he went off to Vietnam, or whenever he would fill out that paperwork. But by that time he had married a Norfolk girl, and they had an infant at home when he went off to Vietnam for his second tour of duty. And he went back early because things weren't good in Vietnam, and he wanted to be there with his buddies. Some of you may have done the same thing, I don't know. So that was the career servicemen. If you look at that list of people, Jerry Allen, I mentioned Jerome Chandler already, Roger Hunt, Stephen Struby, and Michael Wimhoff. Most of those are on the bottom row, aren't they? They're all above. They were all drafted. Hunt graduated from high school in '68, went to work for the railroad, the C&E, and I call it in the book, I call it the family business. His dad worked for the railroad. 3 uncles worked for the railroad. His grandfather was an engineer for the railroad. And so it was kind of the thing to do. Probably the best blue-collar job in Norfolk at that time was the railroad. And he was there a short time, and then, he was drafted. But his dad was, they were patriotic people. There was no question. Hey, Smitty, I just noticed you. A friend of mine from high school is back there. Struby, I mentioned, he actually went to Kearney Reform School for a while before he messed up again when he got out and he went to the Army. And then Wimhoff, I'll talk more about Mike Wimhoff's story because it's very unusual about how he ends up being drafted. I'll talk about that. Gerald Meisinger and Claude Van Andel, they volunteered for the draft. They were both in college and really wondering why they were in college. For Meisinger in particular, it was, why am I in college when some of my buddies are over in Vietnam? So they volunteered for the draft. And then I mentioned a few of these guys who were married. There were actually 5 of these men were married. I mentioned Dennis Anderson, married with 4 children. Jerry Allen, I haven't talked about him. He was married, they had an infant daughter. Tom Sherrick, 4 children. Jerome Chandler and his wife had an infant daughter. Wimhoff was married, but they didn't have any kids yet. In fact, his His wife was younger than him. She was just 18 years old when they got married. She was still 18. I don't have time to talk about this entire book. I know you'd like me to stand up here and read the book to you, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about a few surprising developments that occurred as I researched. I already mentioned Dennis Anderson, accidental homicide. What is that? But there were others, a lot. In almost every chapter, I found out something that was surprising, in some cases almost shocking. So I'm going to talk about a couple of cases of that. And one is Michael Wimhoff. And I'll read a little short section from the book as well. Mike died in 1971. One of the surprising developments there was I actually talked to the medic who treated him after he was blown up by a mine. I didn't expect to find people like that, but he had, I don't know, there's a source called the Wall of Faces. It's attached to the Vietnam Wall Memorial website, and you can, type in a soldier's name, and up pops some basic information, much like the call file database information. And then there's a spot for people to leave memories. And one of the memories was this guy named David Sullivan, put his full name on there, Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was the medic who tried to save Mike Wimhoff. And so I did, one thing I did as a research tool, I subscribed to whitepages.com, and I actually found, sometimes I would be wrong. I'd call somebody and they with the same name and they would, who? What? No, slam. But I got a hold of David Sullivan and we had a long discussion. He told me about that day that Mike, he thought Mike was going to make it, but about 4 hours later he died. So, the circumstances of Michael Wimhoff being in the Army are very unusual. I'll talk about it a little bit to set up the conclusion to that chapter that I'm going to read you. He graduated from Norfolk Catholic High in 1968, and he became fast friends with a guy named Bart Tillotson. Now, Bart said we'd gone to Catholic school in Norfolk for 12 years together and really didn't know each other at all. But for some reason that summer, we became fast friends. He said, Mike convinced me that we should join the Navy. Mike's dad had been in the Navy as Seabee during World War II in Southeast, in the Pacific, right? Been wounded twice. His mother during World War II, she had worked at the bomb factory in Grand Island, and her sister worked there too. During the Vietnam War, before Mike ever entered the service, his mom, they were a little short on cash, so she went down and lived with her sister, and they worked making bombs for the Vietnam War. So this is a, patriotic family, to say the least. So Mike, all fired up, let's join the Navy. So in the fall of 1968, Mike and his buddy go to Omaha. Bart passes his physical, and he's in the Navy. You know how it works. You pass the physical, and you're in. Mike failed his physical. He had a hernia he didn't know about. I wonder what was hurting. And they said, you've got two options. Join the Navy. We'll do surgery on you, repair your hernia. We'll give you convalescent time before you go to basic. During that period, you will get a paycheck. You won't have to pay for your surgery, and that time will count towards your enlistment. Or you can go home. And Bart was not happy when Mike chose to go home. Surprised the heck out of him. So he went back to Norfolk and resumed his job. And one of his, and this is kind of an important part of the story, because when I talked to Mike's brothers, they told me being in a rock band was a big deal to all of us. He had three brothers who formed this rock band, and then they gathered people. The name of the rock band was Third Stone from the Sun. So I eventually got a hold of a guy and I said, well, how would you describe your music? He said, kind of like practice. It wasn't really well refined, but wherever he went, kids seemed to like it. In fact, Mike met his fiance up in South Dakota. He was the drummer for the band, and they somehow connected. So anyway, he goes back to his life of work and playing in the band. And in the spring of 1970, he gets his draft notice for the Army. I'm pretty sure he thought he was done with worrying about that, but he wasn't. And he didn't, he didn't complain or anything, or didn't try to say, hey, what about my hernia? He'd never had it fixed. And so by May and June, he was at basic training. He was supposed to get married to this girl. She was going to graduate in 1970, and they were going to get married right after she graduated in June. They had to postpone that. He went off to basic and AIT, and came back in October, and they got married. And 2 weeks later, he went to Vietnam. So that's how he got to Vietnam. Now I'd like to read kind of the conclusion of that chapter. And it combines the fact that, Mike's choice, he made a choice. And also his friend, Bart, one of his remembrances about that time, and I guess his regret. Bart told me that he'd been to the cemetery outside of Humphrey, where Mike was buried. It's a little rural cemetery attached to a, I guess you'd say an inactive Catholic church. But that's where the Wimhoff families homesteaded back in the 1800s. So there's Wimhoffs about a third of the cemetery. You see Wimhoff. I went to the cemetery, and this kind of brings together several of those elements I just talked about. I can find it here. This is as I'm leaving the cemetery in my truck. I returned to my truck and slowly drove back to the highway, thinking of a conversation I'd had. Bart Tillotson was not able to attend Mike's funeral, but he has visited St. Mary of the Angels. When I came back to Norfolk to visit my mother, I often went over to talk to Mike's dad, he told me. Several times Bart drove down to visit Mike as well. There was sadness and regret in Bart's voice. I couldn't help but think of that time in 1968. I wonder what would have happened if Mike had decided to join the Navy, if he hadn't been drafted into the Army. It's just something that I think about. Bart Tillotson spoke from the heart, but his reasoning is sound, supported by facts. 83% of all U.S. casualties during the Vietnam War took place during combat infantry operations. Of the more than 58,000 deaths in Vietnam, over 46,000 occurred in combat. And the Army and the Marines accounted for 95% of this total. Furthermore, as the war progressed, draftees made up an ever greater percentage of troops killed in action. In 1965, for example, draftees made up just 16% of battlefield deaths. By 1970, that figure rose to 43%. Had Mike opted to enlist in the Navy, as he had originally planned, it's much more likely that he would have survived the tour of Vietnam. In retrospect, Mike's choice may have cost him everything, but he was not alone when it came to life and death decision-making. During the course of the war, millions of young men faced similar prospects to enlist, to present themselves for the draft, to seek some sort of deferment, or to leave the country they called home. Their decisions were subject to laws and policies enacted by Congress and enforced by the Commander-in-Chief. In Michael Wimhoff's case, someone, whether a nameless Army bureaucrat or the local Selective Service Board, revisited his file and decided that he should be drafted. What had changed in Mike's situation that would justify such a move? It is hard to know, for at times who was drafted and who was not was something as a mystery, which I'm sure some of you can attest to. The draft was something of a mystery at times. There were rules and guidelines, but there also seemed to be exceptions. Was it reasonable for Mike to think that he was no longer subject to the draft? Mike Wimhoff was surprised by the Army's decision to draft him a year and a half after he'd failed his physical. Nonetheless, he did not challenge his call to serve. He was, after all, the son of a World War II veteran, and his mother worked in a defense plant. With Joelle, that was his fiancée, he rearranged their wedding plans, then reported for basic training. It all had happened so fast. An engagement, a draft notice, a wedding postponed, followed by boot camp. In October, Mike and Jo Ellen reunited for their wedding vows. Then Mike was gone, flying to South Vietnam, serving with the 11th Armored Cavalry Division. Army Private Michael Wimhoff, 20 years old at the time of his death, was one of 396 Nebraskans to lose their lives in Vietnam. So, choices. How do you guys remember the choices? And it was kind of a stressful time, probably making some of those decisions. What were you going to do? How many of you served in, say, from 65 to 67 in Vietnam? Anybody? Okay. How about 68 and 69?
Well, it was 68, 69. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Really fun time in Vietnam then. Yeah. When I'm doing research, of course, everybody always focuses on, for good reason, the Tet Offensive started in January. There were 2 more offensives that year. If you were there, you knew. They all failed, but they were maximum efforts to maybe win the war within a year. That's what the enemy was thinking. And I recall I was a high school history teacher, and every year we studied Vietnam, I would show them the old bound volumes the libraries used to have of Life magazine. And one of the last editions of Life, or I don't know if that's the right word, but in the back of that big, thick book was a magazine, the Life magazine from the last issue in May. And it was 1 week of American Dead. Maybe some of you have seen that. And it included pictures of every man who died in Vietnam that week. And it had, there was already a shift in public opinion started in 68. And I imagine that had, you saw the faces, kind of like this handout. You see the faces and the names. I showed that to the class a number of times. And the last page were just the names of guys who died that week, but they didn't have their photos. They couldn't show their photos, hadn't got their photos. So they just listed their names. And I'm putting the book down and talking to them. I looked down, and I did not realize this until that moment. Claude Van Andel, Army Sergeant, Norfolk, Nebraska. It's like, and I kind of knew him. He was my sister's age. And I was kind of like, oh. How come I didn't notice that before? But that was quite an issue. Another person I'd like to talk about a little bit more in detail is Thomas Sherrick. It took me a while to figure out how to pronounce his name. But at one of my presentations in Norfolk in 2023, I was talking about, I didn't know exactly how to pronounce his name. And a young woman raised her hand. Her dad was his cousin, and she knew it was Sherrick. She was pretty sure she knew it was Sherrick because her maiden name was Sherrick. So that's the way it's pronounced. But Tom Sherrick, he was a farm kid. And in fact, that's the way the chapter starts, talking about the Sherrick farm. Some brothers had homesteaded. But he didn't want to be a farmer. He told his dad, I imagine he was probably in 6th grade, 7th grade. He told his dad, I want to be a pilot, Dad. His dad was fine with that. And so he said, you'll have to get good grades. And Tom Sherrick got good grades. In fact, one of the interesting things I found out, if I called Norfolk High School, public high school, I could get the transcripts of everybody who had gone there. That's most of these guys. I was very surprised. Tom Sherrick was a very good student. A's and B's, not straight A's like kids get nowadays. It was a little tougher back then. But 2 of the classes he took were Aeronautics 1 and 2 in high school. So I imagine he'd been up in a training plane at least. His instructor was a guy who actually worked at Carl Stephan Airfield there, was a World War II pilot, and he taught high school kids. So he was building on that dream when he was in high school, taking all the math that he could. And when he was 19, after 2 years at the local community college, he received an appointment to go to Pensacola, Florida Naval Flight School. His dream, you know. So he has quite a few stories. I was able to talk to a guy who was about his age. Also, Tom Sherrick became a carrier pilot. That's kind of almost the highest level, right? And this guy lived across the street with his 4 kids. They were friends. I was able to talk to him. The last time I talked to him was a couple months ago. He's 92 years old now and still very sharp. So I got a lot of information from him as well. Tom Sharp didn't go to Vietnam right away because he this is almost stereotypical, he wrecked his sports car and broke his legs out pretty good. So he had to go through a couple of years of rehab and then recertification to be able to get back in the driver's seats, so to speak. On March 1st, 1968, his first mission, flying off the USS Enterprise, his target was in North Vietnam. It was an NVA barracks he was to bomb. And right next to him was his bombardier navigator, a man named Richard Lanham from Tennessee. And they went off together, and they never came back. So Tom was MIA. And then after the prisoners of war, remember, came home in the spring of 1973, the ones that had survived, there was a lot of, those guys were interviewed, and one of the names they were searching for, did you ever hear of a guy named Tom Sherrick? Did you ever meet Tom Sherrick? Did he ever come to your camp? How about Richard Lanham? No, no. So by 1974, they decided that Sherrick and Lanham were dead. And Eileen Sherrick actually had her husband declared dead because that then enabled her high school girls who were going to college to get some scholarship money and get some other kind of money to help the family. So he's MIA and didn't know where they went down, if they went down. The hope was at first that they had parachuted out and were POWs. That didn't materialize. So that was, and of course this chapter is very detailed because his son was also so interested in his dad's career that he gave me all kinds of information and family stories. And it's really, I think you would enjoy actually reading it, even though it has, as they all have, all these chapters, a sad ending. I'm going to read the last 2 paragraphs in the chapter on Tom Sherrick, chapter 3. One of the things that happened, I finished that chapter in, I think, probably July of 2018. And in December of 2018, I checked an internet source that I had been using. It was from the Department of Defense POW MIA accounting agency. That was formed in 1974. And it's very descriptive, what I just said, POW, MIA, county agency. And they had a list of all the missing in action. And here, you know, you look at the list, here's Richard Lanham, here's Thomas Sherrick. So I checked the list. Richard Lanham's name was missing from the list. Tom Sherrick's was still on the list. What happened? I went to their news releases and discovered they had 3 news releases starting in October of that year. And the first one gave little information, then more and more information. A Vietnamese team, based on some sources, had gone over to an island that had a mountain on top of it, gone 2.5 hours up the side of this mountain and excavated 6 times, excavated a crash site. Early on, they were able to, I mean, this is 50 years later, just about, Early on, they were able to identify the aircraft as Tom Sherrick's aircraft. They found some personal effects. You can imagine how degraded that site and overgrown that site was. Ossified material. Tom Jr. later told me the ossified material was about that big. And so they did a DNA test on it with the cooperation of both families, and it was identified as Richard Lanham. So on March 1st, 2019, there was a big ceremony in Union City, Tennessee, and he was laid to rest. The keynote speaker, I actually talked to a newspaper lady down there and a television reporter before it happened, but the key speaker was his wife. When he died, she had remarried, she had kids, she had grandkids, and she told the audience what her husband was like back then. So that was surprising to me that happened. The last part of her speech, she talked about MIA families in general, and she said, I hope there'll be a day that someday they will find out what happened to their loved one. It will be a day like none other. So I kind of pick up on that quote and then talk about a conversation I had with Tom Jr. See if I can find the page here. So this is based on the conversation, an email conversation I had with Tom Jr. For the time being, the family of Thomas Sherrick can only imagine a day like none other. The unearthing of their father's crash site, the place where he died so many years ago, was in itself remarkable. They are grateful for the knowledge that discovery has brought them, and yet their search for closure is incomplete. They long for the day when the body of their beloved is brought home. The family wonders if anyone will ever go back to search once again. Given the remote nature of the place, it seems unlikely. But consider this question. What was the probability that the crash site would be located over 50 years after the event? In February of 2020, I received a message from Tom Sherrick Jr. He wanted me to know that his mother, Eileen, had died a few weeks earlier on January 19th. Tom recalled one of their final conversations. Eileen expressed her deep regret that the Sherrick family had been unable to give her husband, their father, a proper burial. Tom Jr. reminded her that soon, perhaps very soon, Eileen would be united with her husband. I know, she whispered. I know. And so there's a small place where hope still exists in the hearts and minds of those who knew and loved Tom Sherrick. In that place, one can imagine a day in the future when the family will come together once again. On that day, they will celebrate his life as they return his body to the soil of the nation he serves so well. It is their fervent wish that this happens. Let it be so. So even though they've located the crash site, even though they have remains from Richard Lanham, technically Tom Sherrick is still missing in action because they didn't find any part of his body, which probably is not that surprising. But so does anybody have any questions about Wim Hof or Sherrick? I'm going to wrap up with one more story. I'm not going to read from the book. Sorry. You'll have to get the book. This is early on when I was writing this book, my sister, who was sort of the impatient kind, was wondering, what's the title going to be? Of course, I hadn't even thought about it because I didn't know if I could actually finish the book. You'd hit roadblocks, you know. I really need this piece of information. I can't find it, and then 3 months later it might appear, you know. So I didn't know, so I just kind of flippantly said, I think an appropriate title would be A Collection of Sad, Sad Stories. Because that was kind of the way I was feeling. Even though there are parts of this that are funny. Things that happen that are funny that are reported to me. I think the saddest story for me is Roger Hunt. Roger was one of those kids that smiled a lot, told jokes a lot, good kid. Also kind of a well-built kid. But he was drafted into the Army. And he was in Vietnam only about 2 weeks when a mine exploded in front of him, or a booby trap, and just wrecked him. He didn't die. He was into a field hospital, then on to a regular hospital where one of his legs was amputated to save his life. He didn't die. He kept living. They had to amputate another leg. Eventually, they amputated one of his arms, just below the elbow. And eventually, because his face was perfectly fine, but the concussion had messed up his brain, they did a lobotomy on him. And as this kept going on, things started getting worse and worse, his condition. And on October 15th, he was wounded. He died in December 3rd. So about 6 weeks. He never left Vietnam because his condition was so fragile. They kept him there. So I thought, this is where you're thinking when you're the writer, what kind of sources am I going to have about this? And he couldn't write a letter home, he couldn't talk. He could, early on, I found out he could nod and his eyes would light up and he would, in his own way, his sense of humor was still intact. Well, his brother, long after his parents had died, found this big cardboard box in his mother's and father's closet and went to look at what was in there. There was all this stuff. And I met Bruce Hunt at the public library in Norfolk, and here he comes with this big box. My brother was there. And he sets it down and he starts pulling things out. Medals, pictures, funeral program. And then, of course, I'm thinking, well, I need something more, Then he starts pulling out these letters written to his parents by ministers that were at the hospital, Army chaplains, describing his condition. And this kid was he's a product of Lutheran schools in Norfolk. He'd gone to Lutheran grade school. Pretty religious kid. So they're writing letters to the parents, describing their conversations with Roger, his spirits, some of the jokes he would tell, sort of. And also, we prayed together, things like that. So I had these letters. This is great. And then I found another letter from a guy named Joel Fitch, who I didn't know who he was, but I gathered he's from Norfolk. He sort of knows Roger. And I searched around a little bit, and he was class of '66, Norfolk guy. He would get these articles from the Norfolk Daily News, a local paper, from his mother. He's in Vietnam. He's a medical records officer. And she says, Roger Hunt has been seriously wounded in Vietnam. That was the title of the newspaper article. He found out where he was. He was 15 minutes away. He started visiting him and taking the articles, sharing the news with him. And then he wrote the parents. Kind of amazing. I think what he did was pretty amazing. He would write the parents, and he was kind of afraid, I think, that the Army wasn't giving him this straight story. So I'm here to tell you the truth. Roger's doing great, considering. Trying to give him some hope. When I found out who Joel Fitch was, he lived in Omaha, and I had subscribed to whitepages.com, so I found his number, I thought, and I called him up. It was kind of I couldn't find any other way to contact him. Cold call, Explained who I was, what I was doing, and I'd read these letters that he wrote home to Mr. and Mrs. Hunt. And he was kind of shocked by the whole thing. And kind of reluctant to talk, but he talked. Very slow cadence. not much volume. At one point, I thought he hung up on me. I think he was crying a little bit. And he said, at one point, he said, I haven't talked to anybody about this for 50 years. So we talked some more. And then the last thing, one of the last things he said to me, he got real quiet. He said, I was there the day Roger died. So that's a testament to the brotherly love among soldiers, isn't it? Definitely. So that, I think, is the saddest story. I get a little emotional talking about it. Because I knew Roger a little bit. And it just took him so long to die. The last 2 weeks of his life, of course, was pretty much comatose. But, so, do you have any questions or comments, or we can have a discussion? Believe it or not, I actually cut this short. Yesterday I ran over time and I was like, okay, I gotta cut something out here. But what my goal was to write a story that honors the men and their families. Because that, you know, as I mentioned, I think talking to the families 50 years later, it still hurts. It still hurts, and I'm sure for some of you, you had good buddies. It still hurts. Hard to talk about. And you can learn a lot about these young men and their background. Some of the stories are funny, some are sad, and of course, the ending story of their time in Vietnam is sad. But, you know, I wanted people to know these guys. I thought it was important. And that's why I wrote the book. So, any questions, comments? I'll be selling the book up here for $20. I don't have credit card capability, so checks are fine. $20 bill would be great. But I want to thank you for your attention. I mean, you've been very attentive. I was looking around. I don't think anybody fell asleep. I was looking for it. You know, I'm an high school teacher, so, you know, I have ways of waking people up if they did fall asleep. In fact, I was telling my brother about a kid that put his head down at the end of the last period of the day, and the bell rang and everybody got and left, and he just was sleeping away. And I thought, well, let's see if Rhett can set a record. Because there was a kid that had a record of 15 minutes of sleeping past the bell. And Rhett, unfortunately, woke up in about 12 minutes and was very angry with me that I had just let him sleep. But anyway. Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.